Progressive. I'm Sharon Kyle.
And I'm Dick Price, the executive editor of LA Progressive.
And I'm the publisher. And so we're going to be talking over the next 15 minutes about the last 20 years. We've been married for 20 years, but we also co-founded the LA Progressive 15 years ago. And what we want to talk about is how our impressions, our views of this country have changed since being together and since founding the LA Progressive. So, Dick, you and I were having a conversation earlier, and you were talking about, being raised in the 60s and 70s, I guess 50s and 60s for you. So, tell me what your impression of the country was then, and how do you feel about it now, and how much of those impressions have been shaped by your marriage to me and your readings of the LA Progressive.
Sure. So one of my favorite memories is getting up early in the morning, even in junior high school, and going out in the dark and reading the Minneapolis Star and Tribune with my dad. And he'd have a cup of coffee and I'd have a glass of milk. I mean, it was early, it was dawn. And then at some point, he would go off to teach school and I would go off to attend school. So I've always been a big reader. I've always been on top of what's going on in the world. And living in the suburbs of Minneapolis, the far out, almost exclusively white suburbs, not wealthy, but solid. Everybody had a job. The world looked kind of rosy. I mean, I was lightly involved or on the edge of the civil rights movement, and there'd been what looked to me, to this white kid, as some real progress in education and job opportunities. And I had kind of a rosy view of the world back then. So now, 15 years of reading the LA Progressive, my reading, which was also always pretty strong, has been supercharged. I mean, we've published 20,000 articles. My nose has been in every issue. And so now the world, partly because of that reading, my view of the world is much more alarmed, much more concerned. It seems like we're in big trouble. And then the other thing that I would say, in the 15, 20 years you and I have been together, the world has gone to hell in a handbasket, one way or another. I mean, the ice caps are melting, Greenland is melting. We end 2 decades of horrible mistaken war, and we're already trying to get back in another war. 60,000 homeless on the streets of Los Angeles. It looks, and no easy solution around, and no political will to address the solutions that are needed. So the world looks a lot grimmer.
Okay, if I could jump in here.
Go
So
ahead.
early on in our relationship, um, I'd say probably the first 5 to 7 years that we were together, we had a recurring dispute. Sometimes um, it would blossom into a full-on argument. And the dispute was about whether or not this country is improving, particularly around racial issues. And you took the position that there have been improvements. And my position was, I'm not so sure. I've seen change. I wouldn't necessarily characterize that change as progress. And I want to talk, I'm going to give some examples for it. So for example, before I was born, there was a major piece of legislation, Brown v. Board of Education. And I say it was before I was born. It's significant that it was before I was born because that piece of legislation desegregating public schools in the United States, that piece of legislation was ruled upon before I was born. And you would think that my life would have been impacted in a major way, yet that was not my experience. So, although the laws changed regarding the segregation of the public school system, the actual practice didn't change. So, when you and I would get into this debate about things progressing, I would say, well, it seems like it, but boots on the ground, lived experience says no. Um, and I think that over time your position may have changed a bit. I'm not sure.
Well, sure. Part of it depends on where you sit. So when I was a youngster, when I was a young man, I was certainly not embedded in the Black community. I had my in high school, my idol was my friend across the street, and I associated with Black people in the army and in sports and so forth. But I wasn't embedded. And even now, you and I, now I have a big Black family, but you and I on our hilltop are not embedded in the Black community. When I was younger, I was reading the news about the Brown v. Education and how it was going to be a big boost to Black people. That's how it was sold, and that's how I understood it. And so to me, that was progress. Now we know that these 50 years later, schools are more segregated than they were when the law was passed. Uh, Black schools are ignored and abused and over policed, and that goes across a whole range of issues. So I think you, being a Black person at times in your life embedded in the Black community, understanding that the ultimate effect beyond the headlines that I was reading was kind of not so much for Black people. So I understand that.
Great, great, good, good. Well, that argument that we used to have, we don't have anymore. And sadly, I'd say that it was primarily due to technology, cell phone technology specifically, and the thousands of recordings of unarmed Black people being killed by police. I think had that not happened, had the Black Lives Matter movement not happened, um, many white people, good white people in this country, still wouldn't have a sense of what Black people are talking about when we maintain the position that while things have changed, we're not so sure that things have progressed. Especially, this recent killing of a young man who was shot 60 times. This it it didn't even seem to. I think major media outlets covered the story for maybe 2 or 3 days, and then it just fades into the background. No policy changes, no major policy changes, even after George Floyd was murdered and millions of people around the world marched. No major policy changes. And that's for the extreme cases. But then when you look at discrimination in employment, discrimination in housing, discrimination in medical care, just across the board, all of the systems that are established to make life livable in the United States, Black people tend to get the short end of the stick because those systems are immersed in institutional racism and were built basically as racist systems. So,
Yeah, so I would say that's been part of my education, the fact that the technology, YouTube and so forth has brought scenes before me that were not available when I was younger. But I'd also that you and I have been involved in Black issues down on Skid Row with the Black Brown Clergy Coalition. So I've had more firsthand talks with Black people who are on top of the issues, and that's given me a clearer perspective on what's going on. I mean, I would say that, many people now currently talk about the homeless or the houselessness issue, but they forget to mention that the great bulk of people who are houseless are Black. You go down to Skid Row, it's all Black. And I'm told that there are Latinos, undocumented, who are hiding in the shadows, but it's what you see are Black people. But I don't think, I don't think the general news acknowledges that fact.
no, they don't acknowledge that fact. And that has been the practice in the United States, is to try to act as if we live in a colorblind society. So when I often talk about the race being a central factor in the country from the beginnings of this country. We've racialized problems, racialized people, except we have not racialized white people. White people are just the norm, and everybody else is racialized. But we tend to not, we being the major media outlets, educational systems, we don't draw a nexus between economic conditions, the intersection between class and race, the intersection between class, gender, and race. And so it comes across as though the people who are suffering from inequities that are associated with race, class, and gender, it comes across as we're the ones that are always complaining, but everybody else is just fine. And in a sense, everybody else is just fine.
Well,
So,
so I would say you have pressed that issue of the centrality of race, and you from the start with LA Progressive, and I was slow to pick it up, but I think the scales have fallen from my eyes to some extent, and I do see that whatever issue you talk about, housing, homelessness, transportation, Medicare for all, if you don't recognize the central role that race and racism and racists are playing in the lack of progress in those areas, then you're missing the boat. So I fully adopt that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I have to admit that being the publisher of the LA Progressive, and you mentioned that we published 20,000, it's actually 25,000 articles. Being the publisher has also opened my eyes to a lot. We both read a lot, but I read much more in terms of the kind of content that's related to social justice. I read that content much more than I ever did because I need to be informed as the publisher of the LA Progressive. So I just pulled up some notes that I have on my screen right now. So some of the readings that I've done are Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who has a new book out, Conquest. Oh no, I'm sorry. That's her old book, City of Inmates: Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles. Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. Elliot Jaspin, Buried in the Bitter Waters. I have a list of about 100 different authors and books they have written that I have read. I wish I could say that those readings have left me with a sense of hope for this country. They haven't left me hopeless, but it's really eye-opening how much of our history was whitewashed and how much of our history we didn't get if we just went to public school or even in college. We
So
don't get the full history. Go ahead, honey.
so I think our effort, especially around the centrality of race, but the fact that we put out 25,000 articles that hone in on a deep truth, and people are picking it up. People appreciate it. People need to know these things because I mean, oftentimes with racism, there's things happen. I mean, like in the creation of the highways that would divide a Black community off, the redlining, the poor schools for Black people. Those didn't happen by accident. I mean, some people wanted it just that way, some white people. But the great bulk of white people were ignorant of it. They didn't care enough, they didn't see enough, they didn't know enough, and it happened. I think our efforts are making a small dent in that. We're making it harder not to know of that kind of discrimination and inequality. At least I hope so.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one thing that I've learned is that oftentimes white people see racism as conscious hate, as hate that is it's the hatred of an individual, as opposed to something much bigger, which is a complex system of social and political levers and pulleys that were set up generations ago and continue working on behalf of whites at other people's expense. And I think if we deepen our understanding of racism and we develop a language that we all understand, we might be in a better position to knock down um, unearned privileges, or at least acknowledge unearned privileges and unearned detriment. Um, and that would get us a lot closer to having the kind of equitable society that so many people want to believe that we have, that we really don't have.
So I'll go back to my opening statement about how the world seemed to have gotten a lot worse in recent years, and in particular around race and racist issues. And there are people who are not absent-mindedly racist. There are hard-thinking racists who are trying to punish Black people, trying to marginalize them, and they're on the rise. Uh, and and it's not clear how they're going to be stopped. And they certainly won't be stopped if a bunch of white people like me don't rise up and stop them. Certainly Black people are going to do their part, but Black people are 10% of the population. Good white people like me are another 3%, or maybe more.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, so why is this important? Well, the reason that I talk about the centrality of race is that race is a bellwether. It's an indicator that helps us to gauge the health of this so-called democracy. So when it comes to assessing the health of a democracy, there's a lot of indicators that we can use. But if we look at race as an indicator, that's sort of a shorthand to help us to identify problems sooner before they begin to, it's almost like a cancer. If you have the early warning signs of cancer and you catch it in the early stages, then you're in a better position to get rid of it, as opposed to seeing early signs and doing nothing. For example, if you look at the 2008 foreclosure crisis, had we looked at what was happening with Black people who were losing their homes left and right, they began to lose their homes first for the same reasons that the rest of the country eventually did. But had we checked it out and nipped it in the bud, then we wouldn't, or maybe we wouldn't have experienced the depths of the recession of 2008.
Yeah, another good example, we mentioned the Brown versus Board of Education, which was supposed to integrate schools so that Black kids would get a more fair education. But almost immediately, large parts of the white communities pushed back. They ran off to white flight cities, so they would still have all white schools. They started creating Christian religious schools, private schools, so that and then the public schools would be underfunded. And so that's how it worked for Black people, so that they didn't get good schooling. But now we see that has spread to the charter movement, which is boulderizing public schools, and our public schools are fraying if they're not falling apart. And I don't think it's by accident. I mean, there are people in charge of this world who need a lot of Walmart workers and a lot of fast food workers, and they don't need a lot of people with college educations or deep reading, because with college educations, my God, you might figure out what the hell's going on.
Yeah, yeah. You and I have gone to a lot of educational forums over the years, and when you were talking about Brown v. Board of Education, and what came to mind for me was a presentation that we went to that was given by one of the Little Rock Nine.
I remember.
Yeah, and his name is escaping me right now. He lives right here in Pasadena. He went on to get a degree in psychology, but he talked about what it was like to be 14, 15 years old during that entire year, going to Little Rock High School. There were nine of them. And he talked about their day-to-day experiences, which very few people, you see the National Guard had to be called in to escort the students into the building. But after they got into the building, that's where the camera stopped rolling. And it was after they got into the building that hell started for them. He told us that each and every one of those students had their own individual tormentor that followed them around and hit them and spit on them, and they got no protection from the faculty or staff. In fact, he had an incident where he was in the boys' locker room and he opened up his locker and they had filled his locker with water. So everything in his locker was just soaking, his clothes, everything. And as he sat there trying to figure out what to do, a kid comes up to him and throws one of those locks, those, what do you
Padlock,
call it?
padlock.
Padlocks, threw it at him with all force and hit him in the side of his temple, knocked him out cold. And he's on the floor, he's wet. He was eventually able to get to a staff person's office, and he asked him to call his mom. So his mom, all of the difficulty he'd had up until that point, he didn't want to tell his parents
Right.
because his parents were worried enough about them going there. He didn't want them to know what it was like inside the school. But he finally called his mother, and his mother came up and got him. And that day, well, when his mother got the phone call, she was scared to death because what she wasn't telling him was she was getting all these calls saying, "We're going to kill your son today. And the next phone call you get will be from the school." But they endured. But what happened the year after, they didn't go to Little Rock. The reason they didn't go to Little Rock High School was the high school was closed down. The city of Little Rock would rather close down the school rather than have it be desegregated. And so he then moved out to California.
But you know that if the story that got transmitted around the world was the first quarter of that story, Brown v. Education, National Guard, marching the kids into school, all is wonderful. Aren't we a bunch of good white people?
That's right. And that's the point of those stories. And that was the role that major media served. The whole thing was about making the United States look good to the rest of the world as we accused the rest of the world, particularly the Soviet Union in the Cold War. We wanted to look like that shining, glorious city at the top of the hill doing everything right, even for Black people.
Right.
But that's all it was. It was just a story. The reality for Black people didn't change. So
Right.
I shouldn't say didn't change. There was change, but progress, I don't know.
Thank you
Still
for
don't know.
sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.